Hi, this is Dr. Randy Bach. Today's December 2021, and this is our, I don't know, 300th. It's actually probably around our 55th um, coronavirus conversation videocast weekly. And I'm very pleased to be in your living room, iPad, cell phone, um, in front of you, being able to discuss some of the issues of today. I hope they all seem rather absurd and outdated very shortly. But this is the longest 15 days to slow the spread anyone's ever seen. It's more than 15 months. Maybe it'll be 15 years. I have no idea. But there have been some changes, and people have to have their own sense and sensibility, to quote Jane Austen, about what to do and how to do it. We were blessed to have a wonderful Thanksgiving. We had, I think, 15 or 16 people with us. And we have a ritual. We go around the table before dinner with food there of what each of us has been thankful for or is thankful for. And a few of the older members of our party wept. And this is not necessarily unusual per se, because people get emotional when they are speaking and speaking in front of people and speaking on a topic that touches them and how they see their lives. But in this case, I guess maybe the two eldest members of our group cried separately, and for similar reasons, because they hadn't been around any people in over a year. And this hasn't been the case for me or my wife. We've tried to conduct business as usual insofar as we can. You need like tango, you need somebody to dance with. um, Takes two to tango, maybe not, maybe three, I don't know, who knows these days. um, and social life needs to be sociable. um, and I've talked about this many times, that through the groups that I belong to, various civic, religious, athletic, various groupings of individuals for different reasons, I've always been on the outlier aspect of this. um, I was speaking with a good friend today, and he said, many people, see the world only in the material sense. They lose track of the spiritual, and as such, this is the deepest fear. To attack the possibility that everything will disappear for them, and obviously death and so forth. And it's easy to exaggerate people, and then people feel cornered and they react strangely. I am in as I said, a few different groups, and some of them have really bright people in them. I guess in a way, we all have our brightnesses, but these are accomplished people, individuals who have done so much in their lives and earned money, and give advice to companies and individuals and so forth. And the same type of scrutiny that they apply in their business dealings somehow is just totally eluded, is just slid over. In the case of coronavirus and COVID. And I find this bizarre. Um, I think I mentioned last week I had been in a meeting. It was our first, grouping in person in over a year. And we had dinner. It was a closed room. And for dinner, everyone took their masks off. And then after dinner, the masks kind of generally filtered back on. I was the last holdout, and I wasn't going to mask under such absurdity. So I took off, but I think it was misinterpreted. I wasn't meaning to be rude. I just want people, if they are that deeply invested in putting masks on in the closed room as adults, when you're making your own decisions in life, theoretically at this point, so be it. Everyone in the room has vaccines, and if you're ever going to catch anything, that's just kind of life, and you have to kind of move on. But if this is, I don't know, I suppose it's just kind of a fear you can't really go against, but you have to. You have to go against that fear, and you have to live your life fully and according to your best estimations. Um, Beatnik Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey is going to return to that which he loves, which I assume is somewhere a cross between mushrooms and himself, although in some ways he may be a proto uh, mushroom, or maybe he has some growing in that beard. I have no idea. An odd guy, but God bless him. He brought Twitter to existence, and Twitter is certainly entertainment at the very least, and theoretically on in its ideal, and is still, essentially the most immediate form of news. So there's going to be content. Everything I needed to know, for instance, about the Kyle Rittenhouse case, I learned from Twitter, but immediately, like within a couple of days. People are just now, in the last, couple of weeks after the trial, or during, finding out, the actual facts of the matter. But, people had assembled videos of that, and the truth was there. It was there immediately. And Twitter is really kind of amazing for that, because you can bypass the news organs. And I wish, one of the organs that the news organs use would be their brains, but it seems that's not to be the case. I think they are dealing more with their heart, fair amount in the kind of medieval sense of using their spleen, their bile. There used to be the four humors, I think, which were phlegm, bile. Kind of not up on my mysticism or previous versions of science, but that was frankly considered science for a good length of time, even amongst physicians, which of those were most operative for you. And people could divine personalities. There's also, I guess, in the Ulysses Grant era, they were doing what was the thing called, where they feel your scalp and they divine your future, your personality, and so forth. There have been a lot of vagaries of how we measure things and how we think we are so sure of what we are so sure about. But anyway, getting back to Twitter, the new CEO, I think his name is Parag Agrawal or something like that. He, everyone goes for his past tweets and so forth, and they're kind of do gotcha stuff. And I think he's probably, essentially, dealing and thinking in terms of race, which is somewhat what the left's, deal is these days. They decry racism, but they only think in racial terms all the time. But more concerning was what he thinks the platform should be. It should not be, strict application or finding of truth. Rather, it should worry about hurting people's sensibilities and not upsetting kind of the apple cart of what people are peddling at any given moment. And basically, I mean, in short, that would be he prefers narrative over truth. And this is a standard mechanism of propaganda through the I say millennia, decades, through humans. I mean, I think, I'm always amazed that we can do so many things, as animals that other animals can't do. But, we still have our tendencies, and we still have our thoughts, our sense, our prejudice, and whatnot. So he doesn't want to upset those. He doesn't want to work outside whatever the group think is. And that's a problem. That's always been a problem for me. For the mask thing, I was, speaking with my good friend, and he's kind of willing to, work on the mask a little bit and try to make the mask less comfortable, less uncomfortable. I'm not going to wear it. I just think this is absurd. I think so. People have to, do the emperor's new clothes. You have to be the child, and point out the realities of the situation, no matter what everyone else is thinking. So this is really incumbent upon you, my listener, in order to make your decisions. Now, I'm going to try to help you make those decisions, because that's what I'm in the business of doing here. And fortunately, like Twitter in its best aspects, the internet in its best aspects, and friends and so forth are able to provide data for us. I'm going to go through Dr. Jessica Rose's slides, and I was fortunate enough to hear her speak on Tuesday. And I'm going to not do it as well as she, but that's life. She's not here. I invited her on the show, and maybe she'll come at some later date. But I'm going to go through some of her slides briefly. I think these are things we've gone over many times before, but it's nice to take a look and see somebody else's point of view about this. And I also do apologize. I'm going to be rather brief tonight, because we are headed to a Hanukkah celebration elsewhere. And so what do we have here? If you care about the future, do not mass vaccinate the children. This is an immunological perspective. So this is Geert van den Bossche, who's, I believe, a Belgian PhD, DVM. Never mass vaccinate a population with a non-sterilizing product across all age groups during a pandemic. Now, that doesn't, flow off the tongue like to be or not to be or something like that. But what he means here is, we do influenza shots, but we do it not during active times. It's tricky to vaccinate during a pandemic unless that vaccine is perfect. What he means by non-sterilizing. So if it's not a perfect product, you should retain the natural immunity aspects of the people who don't get that ill, in this case, children. So children are doing just fine. They don't need to be altered. So he points out these three parts here, and which we'll go over in the slides. One, it's needless. COVID's not a childhood disease. It's kind of funny for me when I look at this. I'm kind of a word guy. It looks like needles. You can see right in there. But yes, needless. It's harmful. They're adverse events, and it's potentially it's dangerous. There's potential for driving variants of concern. So as we see now with the Omicron or whatever variant coming around, I don't personally think Omicron's dangerous, but there is the risk that some variant will come around. There's no reason to be chancing this when there's no purpose and you're not fixing a problem. You're only potentially making things worse because the kids are already okay. You know, this whole thing, are the kids are all right. I think it's from the WHO or something like that. The kids are all right. Don't mess with it. So these go by these points one by one. I'm not going to be able to spend, the same amount of time as she did on this because time is short tonight for me. But she quotes something we've quoted before. Dr. Makary from Johns Hopkins pointed out that in the United States, I mean, it's basically the infection fatality rate for children is zero. In the United States, a total of 335 children under 18 have died with a COVID diagnosis on their death certificate. But apparently, these are all children with other issues like morbid obesity, leukemia, cystic fibrosis, so forth. There's basically zero death rate for kids per se from COVID. Again, I'm not going to be able to have the time to go through all of these. The second point here is harmful. There's obviously there can't be any long-term data for a vaccine that hasn't been around for a long term. And kids have, potentially 90 years, 80 years of long-term ahead of them. My 90-year-old mother-in-law in the basement, she wants every booster that comes down the pike, and God bless her, have them. She doesn't have a long-term about which to worry. And so if there are long-term issues, this is a problem. The VAERS is not a perfect thing. This is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, part of the CDC. These are previous years' vaccines, all of the vaccines combined. This is the COVID reports. That doesn't mean every one of these reports is valid. I want to make a disclaimer there. These are the VAERS reported deaths per year. All vaccines combined, zero, about 10,000 in 2021. So again, that doesn't mean that every death was from the vaccine, because old people can get vaccinated and so forth. But it likely is 20 to 30 times more dangerous than the influenza vaccine. How do I get that? That's from some other studies. I'm not going to be able to pull up a reference right this second. But the data looks to show that there is danger. This is talking about dangers of injecting children. And the probably the best studied one is boys more than girls getting myocarditis. Myocarditis is potentially fatal. I think the fatality rate is about 30-40% 5 years out. And so this is, you're 15 years old, if you have a 30-40% chance with the myocarditis of dying within 5 years, that's a horrible tragedy. And myocarditis is a rare problem in other events. I mean, otherwise, without the vaccine. There is some risk from myocarditis with the COVID virus itself, but most kids at this point have probably been exposed to the virus. If they didn't get myocarditis from that, why would you give it to them, or even the risk of it with the vaccine? The rate is low. It's about 1 in 20,000 kids, but why do this? Because the rate of death or infirmity from COVID is really, close to zero for kids. Why add this additional risk when they've already had the virus most likely anyway? No reason. It's not helping anybody. The kids are not infectious for the adults and so forth. This is the absurdity, and this is getting pushed and pushed and pushed. People are not, I think England's not going to let you on a flight if you're not vaccinated under 11 years old. I think US will probably try to follow all kinds of mandates like this, which are probably not legally backed. There are some, public health rights, I guess, for the government to push, but you have to, pick and choose your problem. And this is not a problem for kids. This is not a problem for kids. This, COVID is not fatal for kids. So dangerous, potential of driving variants of concern. I'm not going to be able to go over this too much. I'm not positive this is the case, because I think personally that viruses tend to attenuate. They tend to get a little bit easier on the populace over time, because if the virus, knocks you over too much, then it's not a successful virus. I'm going to maybe just touch on a few other things. I'm going to go over some slides that I kind of made myself. These are not in perfect order, a little bit haphazard this week, short week, very busy with other things. But I'm going to maybe just zip through these, and then one or two studies afterwards. So let's add these things. Thanksgiving COVID bouncers. This was Axios, is a I guess they are political commentary and news page, I think centered in Washington. I think they lean left. They sometimes have some good stuff on it, but they suggested, I'm not sure who amongst the organization, having bouncers at the doors to block family members that don't provide a negative test from attending Thanksgiving. And so they wanted you to have basically your meeting zone in the garage, and you go over, validate people before they come in. Great. That's going to be your family. Wonderful. People who are vaccinated and elderly, it's a misuse of kids to make them vaccinated and so forth. And it's a misuse of the data and the science to think that you are going to, have any extra benefit to your vaccination by having everybody else vaccinated. Actually, I noticed this Thanksgiving looks like Sarah Jessica Parker, Claire Danes, and is that one of the Wilson brothers, and Diane Keaton. Well, I hope they're all vaccinated. So this is Michael Knowles pointing out up here in the upper left, spoiler alert, there's always going to be another variant, you betcha. And there's some answers here. If you pause this, you can look through some of the quotes in either agreement or opposition. I'll leave it there. So the South African Medical Association says Omicron variant causes mild disease. This was corroborated by one of the doctor in South Africa, one of the physicians or scientists who was noticing this first. Basically, the fact that we have such incredible genetic and scientific laboratory testing allows us to notice these variants. Just think back, if we did this for like the common cold or flu season or whatever, we'd be going nuts, decades ago. Fortunately, our science is great, but fortunately, our science wasn't there, at least for most of my lifetime, to make people go crazy to this extent over changes that may not have any essential difference or rationale for concern. Notably, Martin Kulldorff is at Harvard, a PhD, I believe data scientist, infectious disease expert. He pointed out what everyone's been pointing out, that if you look at the Greek alphabet, and there's alpha, beta, gamma, we were at the Delta variant not that long. I don't know, we seem to have skipped a lot of letters. Maybe there are some other ones out and about, not of great import yet, but clearly we skipped over nu and chi, which is Xi's. The way the Greeks pronounced it was chi, I guess, and the way the fraternities do. They skipped over nu because it sounds like NEW, new, and they skipped over chi because the same letters are the way we spell Xi, President Xi of China. So they didn't want to, bring in the China thing again, because we can't call it Wuhan virus, as we used to call the Hong Kong flu or Shanghai flu or whatever, the place of origin. This is technically the Wuhan coronavirus, but we have to call it something else, and we can't call this variant Xi or Kai because of any pointing at China. This is a little different take. Omicron is an anagram for moronic. Just leave it right there. Things that are going on, I guess I cut this off a little bit. Austria and Australia, they have actually the same root word. Austro means Western, maybe it's Eastern. Austro in Latin, Austria and Australia are both doing crazy things. Australia has basically camps, quarantine camps, which I gather are being discussed even here in the United States. for people who travel and are, possibly going to be Omicron exposed. Austria is back in lockdown despite protests. There's a lot of stuff worse going on in other places. This is COVID protesters in Brussels, which is not in Austria. But Austria has returned to a full national lockdown as protests against these new, restrictions. So, things are actually looking worse in other places, as bad as they are here. I think we've been saved by federalism and by the ability to have states do things individually. We've had a lot more experimentation within our country than they have theoretically across Europe, with the exception of Sweden and UK early on, which UK switched once Boris got the infection. So this is somewhat corroboration of the myocarditis aspect. This is this is clinical research in cardiology, published last week. Ambulatory cardiology consultation for suspected myocarditis after COVID-19 vaccination. The numbers are going up. This is, I guess, from Germany. A few other slides here. This I touch on briefly. People are talking about whether the vaccine, protects people or not. And what percentage of people are showing up at the ER and whatnot, vaccinated or not vaccinated. I kind of don't really like spending time on this too much. I think it's a mistake in looking at it. And I titled this podcast, the case of beer, the case of TB, the case for coronavirus and so forth. Misinterpreting what a case is part of the problem here. I think we need to focus on hospitalizations and deaths. Moreover, if you're going to look at those, you have to do it against baseline population. So, what you can't. It's not enough just to say, oh, there are more deaths amongst the vaccinated than the unvaccinated. That may very well be true. This is in England, I guess October, November. But the point is, who are these people? What are their other illnesses? If the vaccinated tend to skew older, which I would imagine they are, and more older people are dying, well, that's part and parcel. So I think these things are really tough to read. I don't like them. I think they're simplistic, and I would avoid them. So when people are just talking about, percentages, this and that, it doesn't really make much difference or sense unless you're going to subdivide according to who those people actually were and how freely they were diagnosed with COVID and whether the COVID was actually contributory toward their illness or death. This is, I think, endemic or emblematic, excuse me, of the problem. This is, again, every time I look for the weather, I'm much more interested in this. I don't have a small craft, fortunately. I'm not out in the water, but I'm curious about the temperature of the day. Boom, they always pop this up. This is my main concern when I ask about the weather. But you see here that, basically the definition of cases is different. People are milling around. They're going into businesses, schools, whatnot. They get their, noses poked and they have a test. Now, the test may be positive, may be negative, but it's positive they show up here. But really, the whole city, state, and many cities within it are going nuts over something that's not fatal. So I think the real key here is to look at overall fatalities, not the percentages within fatalities. And the numbers are vastly down. So this is either attenuated illness or a population that's reached adequate immunity to go about your business. And this slide covers the same kind of topic. I'm not going to spend time. You can pause it if you want to read this. But again, this is not my cause. I think that you really got to stop, thinking so much about cases and think about severity. There's an interesting point here. Pfizer says it could tweak the current COVID vaccine 100 days, if necessary, in response to Omicron. Well, that'll probably be too late because by the time they get this out for Omicron, that'll probably will have passed. But it's interesting they haven't tweaked the current COVID vaccine yet, since we're so far down the Greek alphabet. You are still getting, if you get a vaccine, you're getting one that is dealing with the so-called ancestral strain, the pre-Greek letter strain of SARS-CoV-2, the one leaked from the China lab. And if they could do it, why don't they do it? What's the point of getting boosters to a variant that is 6 to 8 variants prior, when the virus itself, without thought, but through multiple waves of reproductions of 20 trillion cells each time, whatever, or hundreds of millions within your body, if it keeps migrating its own basic physical appearance, and the one that your antibody using just a single spike protein, the ancestral, is no longer going to be able to recognize. It's basically putting on disguises, or it's turning into different generations, so it has a family resemblance but not precise to the one for which you have been immunized. This goes back to children. You can pause this and read this. It goes back to a similar point from Dr. Rosa's slides. I kind of like this a little bit blurry. I apologize, but this is what we're left with. This is the hippie generation that I grew up with in the 60s and 70s. Everyone was resist authority and questioning everything, and all of a sudden they aged into becoming the authority and do what you're told. Mask up, love the CDC, love all the institutions, no free speech, and this goes back to the issues I mentioned earlier. And so it's just a weird thing that the same folks, basically they are threatened at the end of their lives, and they're willing to throw anybody, no pun intended, under the bus in order to slow down what they think is a ride off the edge of the cliff, but it is not, even for them. These are just some little random things I've picked up. This is not a joke. Mr. Biden's wearing a mask and he coughs during the interview and he takes the mask off to cough. I mean, this is the guy who's going to save us from the virus. I mean, really? The level of comprehension, even if their own absurdities, points out. I mean, this guy doesn't have much of a level of comprehension for very much these days, most likely. Apparently, wrongly counted, or his wife did, the number of grandkids he has, or that was probably purposeful. Anyway, this is just, it's crazy. These are some older tweets. Trump has rolled back progress. He's going to strengthen global health security. We need leadership that builds public trust, focuses on real threats, and mobilize the world to stop outbreaks before they reach our shores. Well, it's just a little ironic because, Omicron's reaching our shores despite all these best efforts. Virus gonna virus. The virus is going to do its thing. And we had, the bulwark of a natural immunity amongst our children and young people, and we kept them indoors for a year, more than a year. This is, not helpful. Similarly, since Twitter, God bless it, does have a memory. This is from a year ago. A wall will not stop. This is when Trump was running. Wall will not stop the coronavirus. Banning travel, that's not going to stop it. And what did he do? Last week he banned travel. This one's a little bit off color. Either you let me stick it in you or you're fired. That's what I used to say. This is Harvey Weinstein, I gather. These mandates, I don't really like keeping this picture up, but these mandates, were put up illegally. The ones about, having employers, have to do kind of the government's bidding to make sure everyone's vaccinated. Those are likely unconstitutional. But the deal is that, they're in long enough, and then you're going to wind up doing it anyway, and so be it. So this one, a slide I liked. Some people wouldn't know tyranny if it covered their faces, locked them in their homes. Biggest wealth transfer, censored them, made them show papers, and forced them to medicate or they lose their job. You got to, be out there doing the stuff that you need to do. It's not enough just to placate. I was, in conversation today. My friend said, they are so desperate and they're so worried, and so forth. There's no sense, just, kind of do what they say and so forth, and, figure out ways to tweak around the edges. I think this has to be confronted, and whether, Twitter or the narrative wants that to happen, that's their problem. You have to kind of be you and point out the absurdities of this. And this is my, I'm old enough to remember him, meeting him in person. Marcus Cicero. The closer the collapse of an empire, the crazier its laws. We have to not be that, and we have to, we kind of have to be the change that we want to see in the world. To quote one Mr. Obama, I guess. I'm just going to very briefly go over some of the quickies here, and you can take a look at these if you want links. I can probably share them with you later. And let's see which ones. Well, maybe I'll start with. Oh, I disappeared. Did I disappear? I apologize. I'm going to start with Igor Chudov. Lancet letter demolishes vaccination. This is from earlier the last few days, I think late November. He's pointing out this letter to the Lancet. My computer's a little bit slow, I apologize. So let's come back to this. An amazing Lancet letter. The epidemiologic relevance of the COVID-19 vaccinated population is increasing. I'm not going to get into the details of this, but the interesting part, which I think he points out, was that it was allowed to be published by the Lancet at all. The Lancet, to its vast and eternal discredit, was publishing false information and pulling down things like Twitter, pulling down things that were true, but went against the narrative. You can look this up regarding, I believe, ivermectin, and there were various other aspects regarding the COVID, where the narrative is more important than anything else. Just as a sidelight, I'm working on a book, my Zika book, and it's finished, and I'm getting it published. And I was going to be working on a graphic novel version or a comic book version, because a lot of people are, the audience that I really want to know about the absence of Zika and the kind of poor underpinning of the Zika microcephaly theory are not necessarily going to be able to, finish and polish off my book. And so I wanted kind of a more man of the street or woman of the street version. And I was talking with an artist, a cartoonist, author, children's book writer. And once she heard that my book might, cast doubt on science or scientists, even though they're wrong, that made her nervous. She's young, she's at like 25 or so, and she has zero risk for COVID. We started to talk a little bit, like she's like, she was really horrified. And I said, well, has COVID affected, anybody in your cohort, anybody young, 20s, whatever, you've been to school with or whatever? She's like, no. But, anyway, it is kind of the image when people watch too much TV or whatever, they think that, somebody around the world is their neighbor, and they lose track of lose sight of the fact that they've themselves are a data point. They've lived through this, COVID emergency, and they know nobody who's had any illness essentially from this, or had any problems any worse than, say, the flu or something like that, because life does have its issues. But basically she was done with me. And mind you, a young lady who's seemingly desperate for work, and she's out there looking for work, and she was very interested for a long time about the payment aspect and whatnot we talked about. But as soon as that it was not going to be working towards a narrative she thought was important, boom, she was done. This happened as well a couple of years ago when I was actually doing the Zika early work, and I had a kind of a researcher helping me, and she did the same thing. She's in New Zealand, and very competent gal. I liked her, but she didn't want to do anything that was going to interfere with the narrative. So that's really the take-home message. You have to interfere with the narrative if the narrative is going to do wrong by you, and we're going to go from there. So just in closing, anybody who says anything about vaccines that's not positive is an anti-vaxxer. I think the term's absurd. I don't like that. I think that is part of the propaganda narrative to kind of discount people and keep the narrative whole and not look at the truth. The truth is, first of all, on a personal basis, I've taken dozens of vaccines myself. I take the flu shot every single year for decades. I think they're awesome, but there's a mistake to think they are perfect. They're not perfect. It's like wearing a raincoat. Going out in the rain, you will get less wet than if you didn't wear one. You will not stay completely dry. Ditto with vaccines. They are imperfect vehicles, but there's some protection. But vaccines are for appropriate times. You shouldn't be taking the yellow fever vaccine just for no reason, just because it exists. And if you're not going to be getting ill from yellow fever, then there's no point of it. If you're not going to be getting ill from COVID, there's also similarly no point from it, although they're slightly different situations. Anyway, I enjoyed talking with you. Please let me know if I can, I don't know, do anything else to help you be interested in our mission here and our podcast. And please share this broadly and widely. I'd appreciate your help in doing so. And if you're interested in the Zika book, send me a note and we will